Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us at the Great Dynamics podcast. My name is Ahmed Hassan, and as I say always, today with me is a friend and a very interesting individual. He's not gonna share his name because of the work that he's doing right now, so we're just gonna call him E. E has over a decade experience in the security and risk sector in the private as well as in the humanitarian sector. He's been to many countries, over 30 countries, and dealt with very interesting and unsavory characters and done so very successfully. And we would love to hear his experience and the lessons learned from him today. E, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be with you and the people that listen.
So what we always do is I ask you, can you give us a bit of a description of where you started and how you got where you are today?
Yeah, definitely. So, I never wanted to be security. That was never my dream. And it was never my dream because, the country I'm coming from, we don't have tradition on, security sector. Basically, it's very underdeveloped, let's say, for the global standards. So when I was a child, I always wanted to be a journalist or something like that. I was extremely curious. And because I was extremely curious, that was, my drive in terms of how to explore the world and etc. But because of different circumstances, I actually became initially, I joined to the military and then from the military to the private security sector because essentially it was similar with journalism. I could see what is happening around me and, I could explore more different uncertainties that, there are there. So after I joined on the private security sector, which is the most interesting part, let's say, on the beginning of my career, I basically started traveling in different worlds, finding different cultures, and this was feeding more my hunger in order to understand, and learn more about the world around us. But this wasn't enough, especially when you're armed. I understood that you're not very much connected with the society. You have a limitation in terms of what you can learn and what you can explore. And then I decided to join the humanitarian sector as security. And that was the most interesting part until now. It's a very diverse, let's say, approach in terms of security risk management. You speak a lot with people, you interact a lot with people, and this is what keeps me, still interested in the sector. So in short, this is my background. I moved from wanting to be a journalist to military and then to private security and then humanitarian security sector.
Do you still have ambitions to be a journalist?
No, not really. I don't think I would be a good journalist because I have a problem to focus. I think to be a good journalist, you need to be able to focus on the story that you want to produce. For me, I'm like from those guys that, reading something or exploring something and then hearing something more interesting, I'm jumping there, and then from there somewhere else, and then somewhere else and somewhere else. And in the end, I have a full picture of something that could be like a tree, like, a full analysis of a context, but it's not, it couldn't serve a story. It is something bigger than that. For instance, in a country that I was in the past, let's say Yemen, I started exploring the tribal, analysis of one particular location. I found myself exploring beyond that, including the relationships between tribes and external actors such as Saudi Arabia or Emirates, and then the relationships between Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and then the relationships between Al Qaeda and Islamic State, and then and all this create a nice mixture of things. But if I was a journalist, I would be really, really bad.
I think it overlaps. I think you'll be a great journalist, but that's just because how I know you. So I think maybe this quest for what's interesting is also what drives journalists to maybe write good stories, I think. But I want to come back on the Yemen because sorry, go ahead.
It could be the case. I think security professionals and journalists have a lot of similarities. especially considering that they all try to go in places that human beings sometimes do not want to be there, but because of their curiosity or because of their mandate, they need to be there.
Let's talk a little bit about joining the humanitarian industry. What was your experience like starting that, and from coming from a security military background?
Yeah, so this is quite interesting, and to be honest, it was a very eye-opening, let's say, situation. And the reason why it was eye-opening is, coming from the private security sector, you have a very conservative, let's say, security risk management approach many times, which, when you try to mitigate risks, most of the times you try to avoid them, or you try to take, extreme conditions, to put extreme controls in place in order to mitigate them. But when I joined in the humanitarian sector, initially I did it because that was, let's say, a natural progress in my career. So from the field, I actually had an offer to be security lead in a country. And basically, having that chance, I thought that I know how to do security risk management. However, I understood very fast that the humanitarian security understands risk not necessarily as something negative. And crisis is not necessarily something negative. What I usually say is that, business resilience, especially for the humanitarian sector, is very much interconnected and linked with business development, something that is not very clear on the private sector. So when I joined to the humanitarian security, I think I saw myself becoming more complete, on the security risk management, sector in total. If I haven't done the private security in the past, I wouldn't be complete on what I'm doing today. But if I haven't done the humanitarian security, I can say that I wouldn't be complete either. This diversity in terms of risk management and risk appetite, I think is fundamental on where I am today, and fundamental in terms of how I understand security risk management.
Can you give an example of a situation or a conflict where the private sector could have learned from looking at risk and security as an opportunity?
Yeah, for instance, in the current ongoing conflict in Ukraine, there is extreme need for companies that, let's say, working a lot, working on the energy sector. That's not the case. Many big players are not there because of a risk-averse type of approach. While, especially last winter, if you remember, Russians were targeting critical infrastructure, especially focusing on the energy side. In contrast, the humanitarian organizations are working in the front lines. There are organizations that are working as close as in Kherson, in, block by block, analyzing where artillery is taking place and working 2 blocks, later from that, And even if we see, the increase of revenue of organizations, we are talking about an average increase of between 15 to 20% increase of revenue annually. This is not happening in any other sector, and this is driven by crisis. Many organizations, especially from the humanitarian perspective, you see them going first just after the military in post-conflict or conflict locations. This is not happening on the private sector. Even when it is about traveling, in some cases, you see that the private sector is quite conservative.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that?
I think many people are coming from with a background on the military, or with a background from the security or police and etc. They haven't really been in the field, or if they have been in the field, they have been in the field as I did in the past. Been armed, been quite disconnected from the society. I think this is one of the reasons that it's quite obvious in my eyes. When I started my career in the humanitarian security sector, I remember that I wasn't allowing, or I was trying to block, my colleagues to go to a detention center to provide humanitarian support. There were a lot of mitigation measures that could be taken, but they were not obvious in my eyes because I have never done that before. Since then, I negotiated, let's say, access in areas where we needed to cross front lines in Yemen, or I negotiated, with criminal groups that were doing carjacking in Cameroon or in other locations. Something that is quite unspeakable for the private sector, but at the same time, it's quite part of the daily business life, for the humanitarian sector.
That's fascinating. Do you think that from a private sector perspective, just playing devil's advocate here, there is maybe a reputational risk component that they don't want to be involved in, or like liabilities that they think are, especially if it's a public company where they have stockholders to think of. Do you think that plays a role in that decision taking, and that supersedes maybe opportunities to do business?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, because we need to see the data, right? For instance, in 2022, 444 aid workers were actually part of casualties across the globe. Around 116 of them died. Private sector do not have similar numbers, and I understand that there might be a concern in terms of reputation, but who defines this concern in the end of the day? I mean, from my perspective, perception is more powerful than the reality, especially when we talk about security risk management. Sometimes we talk about integrating security risk management with other sectors, but in the end of the day, we do not see also communication component as part of the security risk management. This is essentially something that is missing a lot in the private sector.
Do you have a solution for that, or do you have ideas?
Yeah, for instance, I think earlier this year, if I remember well, or late 22, if you remember, there were companies that have been impacted by fake Twitter accounts. Some of the biggest one, I'm not sure if I can mention them, were Lilly & Co. or Martin & Lockheed, that lost billions just because of fake Twitter accounts that started making statements pretending that they're actually the official accounts as a result of what happened in this platform. Those companies were not prepared. And to be honest, no one was prepared about that. But there is a clear lesson learned in terms of how you can integrate, let's say, cybersecurity risk management and physical security risk management and communication departments. For instance, when we do in the humanitarian security sector an attempt to get access in a location, we try to integrate more than one department on that. We can have, public statements that are targeted for particular stakeholders in a context. And this requires a lot of analysis and a lot of, actor mapping understanding, in a context. This is not, for instance, happening in the private sector. From my experience in the private sector, the main focus is on traditional security risk management approaches, such as build doors, build gates, build access control systems, build systems that will, allow you to have a safe base, but not to develop your business.
I found that very interesting, because I think also that in the humanitarian sector, there is this where the crises and conflicts are, or the people affected by it, is the goal, right? Where I think companies often see that as an obstacle for business continuity. And I think also mentality needs to change. There needs to be training on executive level on how to understand these type of risks and not see them just as obstacles, even though it might sound a bit opportunistic, but see the opportunities to not only continue your business where others would not, but increase your business. Do you think there is a space for humanitarian sector and the private sector to work closely together?
Firstly, I couldn't agree more than you, right? Even if we see the ISO 31000, the risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So the objectives are driving what risk we can take and what we define in risk in the end of the day. In my view, I think this has been somehow miscalculated in the private sector. Obviously, the humanitarian sector has a lot to learn about the private sector as well. Private sector has invested a lot in compliance, has invested a lot on systems, has invested a lot on have, a sound policy in place in terms of security risk management. So it's not that the private sector need to learn from the humanitarian security sector. There is a lot of space to learn from each other. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of forums that bring professionals from both sides to talk, about their experiences, to talk about practices, and etc., etc. Even the best practices that we see on security risk management usually are either for people that have a very theoretical backgrounds or people that are not diverse in terms of exposure. And that's not a problem from the private sector. It's also that you don't see very often humanitarian security professionals talk. And sometimes, as happened also in the private sector, those who are talking might not have the full picture of what they should talk about, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting conundrum because we are seeing, for example, in the cyber domain, that there is a lot of connectivity between different types of organizations, maybe private or non-profit organizations. And I think why that cannot be the case on the physical security side or even on reputational risk. And maybe, it's something that is happening slowly and, we cannot see it, but you're closer to that than I am. What I want to ask you is, because this is something that I find fascinating. We talked a lot about the private sector, and I think also there's a lot of things that can be learned from the private sector. Do you think that the humanitarian sector has lessons to learn from the private sector risk management and security approach?
Absolutely. Firstly, you mentioned about the cybersecurity component. This is something that the private sector itself have, invested more than the humanitarian sector have invested historically, right? But even when we talk about the physical security, for instance, the isomorphic learning type of approach that private sector, especially oil and gas companies, have invested a lot, is something that is extremely underinvested on the humanitarian sector. In the humanitarian sector, for a long time, it's very unusual to see lesson learned from incidents that took place, and then many organizations are ending up, in major crises. In the private sector, this wouldn't happen. Beyond that, there is stronger level of compliance. There is also stronger level of accountability that the humanitarian sector, for instance, in some cases doesn't have in place. As I said, I feel complete security risk management, not because I'm working now as humanitarian security, but because I have worked on the private sector. I think one of the elements that I would add in our conversation is that for people to build further their capacity overall, they need to move around, and not necessarily move around companies, but move around sectors. The more you expose yourself on security risk management, the more you expose yourself on different understanding of security risk management and different risk appetites, the more you are completing yourself. And as you said, discussions already are starting. There are forums that host both humanitarian security professionals and private security professionals, or private intelligence, professionals. That wasn't the case before, and this is happening, the last few years. So there is a lot of space for improvement in both sides. So it's not one side better than the other one. I think both sides have gaps that the other side have somehow already filled, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you opened a bit of a door there for me, because we haven't talked about this that much. Well, where do you see the role of intelligence, not just from a private sector such as us, but also within humanitarian organizations to better do their job and to help decision making?
I mean, intelligence or geopolitical analysts, I think, are more important than ever, especially in the world we are living right now, which is extremely fast-paced and, becomes more and more polarized. So it's more difficult for organizations and companies to basically maneuver. See, for instance, in the last triggered by the last war in Israel and Gaza. Many companies are facing reputational risks because they haven't done a proper analysis in terms of how the world see their engagement, within this war. Many organizations also, humanitarian organizations, face the same exact problem. Many organizations have been accused that did not speak as loud as they're speaking in other crises, and that's because of lack of investment on geopolitical analysis. However, many NGOs now are actually have what they call crisis analysis teams that are do intelligence analysis on geopolitical level in terms of upcoming crises that may take place within the next year or so, and that help a lot. Investment of resources, that helps a lot in terms of investment on humanitarian efforts, advocacy, policy, and etc. etc. So there is investment both in the private sector and the humanitarian sector towards this direction, but this investment could be faster than it is right now, if that makes sense.
I have experienced in my career a bit of a apprehension from, and in a lot of cases, rightly so, from the humanitarian sector to even discuss the topic of intelligence, because it can or it's seen as as problematic, because in a lot of countries humanitarian professionals are seen as, oh yeah, they're from an intelligence service, or security service, pretending to help us. So I understand that there's a bit of an apprehension, and maybe a difficult question, but I don't know if that's still the case today. But how do you see overcoming that obstacle? Because that's something we've seen. We've tried to work with humanitarian. I mean, you're a bit of an exception, but other organizations where we see that there is a bit of an apprehension just to talk about the word intelligence.
Well, I think that's a complicated question and has to do about context a lot. And it has to do a lot about context because even the word security is something that many NGOs are not using. In my career as humanitarian security, I had so many titles I cannot remember them. And the reason behind that is because, depending on the context, it was not necessarily easy for me to get access in a country with the title security. If I had intelligence, for instance, in my title, that would be impossible, because it is intelligence for who? Similarly, is in the private sector. Many companies are not using the title of intelligence. There is
Correct.
a lot of effort for colleagues, out there that have invested a lot of personal effort and time in order to change that, even in the private sector. And the private sector change, let's say, it's quite easier than the humanitarian. The reason it's easier is because, for instance, as part of my job as security professional for the humanitarian sector, I needed many times to negotiate or communicate or have meetings with different entities. Either those are governmental actors, a general, for instance, from a military function, or a militant leader, or a warlord, or someone that some entities will call terrorists, and etc. etc. And that's fundamental part of security risk management. You cannot do security risk management, especially if you want to be in the very front line of a conflict, or on a very difficult to go or hard to reach, as we call it in the humanitarian security sector, location, without communicating and negotiating with all the entities. So having in your title something about intelligence, it brings a bit of stress to people, and that's not only on the humanitarian. I think it needs to have an education as a society in terms of what intelligence means. Many people connect intelligence with the CIA or with the dark ops or with whatever you want to call it. So there are a lot of myths, drama, and a lot of hunger for people to pretend that they're someone that they're not. We should not forget that there are also all these people on the social media that they are pretending that they are something that they're not as well. So it's a complicated situation, right?
It is, and I also, this is a conversation I had with my wife about this, which is, I don't know why intelligence professionals always are the bad guys. in movies and TV. It doesn't really help, in popular culture, that it's seen as something dark and mysterious. And really, I mean, there are parts to it, but in actuality, daily, it's pretty mundane. So it's a pretty mundane endeavor, and very much like what a journalist does.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
as you,
And even
yeah,
the security professionals, in many cases, are doing intelligence. You cannot do a context analysis, you cannot do a security risk analysis without collection of information or intelligence and analysis of them. It's something that exists more or less. It's as old as security risk management, but people do not want to call it intelligence.
yeah, and it does a disservice to not just the work that they're doing, but it does a disservice to people that wanna do that type of work, right? So a lot of young people, and it's one of the reasons why I set up this podcast, is to demystify these type of roles, because intelligence is everywhere, but it's not it's not called that. And then young people ask me like, well, I want to work in intelligence, but do I have to go to government? Right? No, there's many other paths that you can take. The problem is, yeah, but they don't advertise that.
And there are a lot of myths beyond that, right?
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
in terms of what could be your nationality so as to get in this sector, or what could be, your background, or what studies you need to do. I think there are a lot of myths out there which, take away a lot of potential talents from the industry and create a lot of, trigger even further mystery and potentially, negative effects for the whole sector. But as you said, intelligence is, everywhere. Even when you open, your social media and want to understand why a protest is taking place nearby your house, this is open source intelligence. It's not any different than what many of us are doing as part of our professional life.
yeah. No, I fully agree with you, and I think this is one of the reasons why we we set up a school, an intelligence school, where we can teach everybody from any walk of life that, hey, you don't have to be. It's not James Bond, right? Or
Please don't
Jason
say
Bourne.
that. There are people that believe that I am James Bond or whatever, and you destroy my myth.
Well, luckily they don't know who you are, right? So that helps them a little bit. But no, I think this is a very important discussion to get into, and to delve into a bit deeper, because this is what I found fascinating, because I've spoken to colleagues of yours where they were like looking maybe at a region or a country, or an area, and the level of knowledge and insight that they held was fascinating to me, because I know that there are organizations, maybe government even, that do not have that level of insight and knowledge. So I definitely think that, you know making I think OSINT has done a good job of bridging that gap and have made it, more acceptable. I think it's also important to understand that just finding information and not analyzing and then reporting on it is not intelligence, it's just information gathering. I keep saying this, and I know a lot of OSINT professionals don't like sometimes me saying this, but I'm not trying to gatekeep, but I have to make sure to make clear what intelligence is and what it's not. But from your perspective, how has the rise of OSINT and OSINT professionals impacted your industry?
I think we are living in an era that is a game change in terms of security risk management in total, and this is driven, you know, by various factors, including the OSINTs, that are out there available. You learn things that traditionally you wouldn't learn for weeks. Sometimes you learn things faster than the government that is getting impacted. For instance, when the war in Ukraine started, I remember that I had in my laptop identified street cameras and that were close to the borders, and those were in live stream. And because I was expecting the war to happen around after 20th of February, I had that in live stream on my home all the time, because I was thinking that if that happened, then certainly it's going to be a country that I will be sent in order to, establish operations. And I remember watching in live stream, the Russian military crossing the borders. Maybe I was able to see that faster than the government itself. Maybe and I'm not saying that in a way to promote on what OSINT can do. I'm saying that on the way that, the information that are out there available is, there are so many and so uncontrollable that changing the game totally, and changing the game in a lot of different factors, not only for the security professionals, but also for the responses of governments, the responses of, authorities in terms of particular events. Now they have more pressure to react in a faster manner than they had before. In the past, they needed to spend time, the news could be potentially controlled. Now they don't have this luxury anymore. They need to take, decision on the spot, which sometimes are not necessarily good ones for this particular reason. For instance, if you remember in Sudan, I think it was July or August 2019, I don't remember the exact month. It was the first, live stream massacre in the history of humans. That have never happened before. And we are talking about, OSINTs that are available to everyone, including children, including, professionals, including anyone out there. So I think there is a game-changing period for our sector, for sure. And there is a game-changing in terms of how good we can be able to analyze and understand things, considering that the world is faster in the pace than before.
Yeah, I think it's important to definitely highlight the importance of OSINT, and the access to information has changed the world forever, and none much more than what's now, for example, happening in Gaza, and the war with Israel and Hamas. And what I find interesting, and this, I would like to hear your opinion on this, because that the open source information domain has become a battle in itself, has become a war in itself. How do humanitarian organizations navigate, these, especially if they are not maybe on the ground, or they are not at locations, or it's inaccessible to them? How do they navigate this new information domain?
I think this is where humanitarian organizations can learn from the private security sector, because they don't invest a lot on that. They have not invested, a lot on that. For instance, in the very beginning of the war in Ukraine, I can give that as an example. I remember that we were trying to understand, where, refugees are going. And we use, I used Google Maps because they saw the traffic. It was as simple as that, This is not something that many other professionals from my sector did, but this is something that, collection of open source intelligence is something that the private sector in many fronts have invested more than the humanitarian security sector, which is more dependent on the individual approaches and the individual investment on outside of the box thinking. But in the war in Gaza that you mentioned, Gaza is now the deadliest war zone for civilians globally, based on figures that the UN is sharing. And it's really important to mention that in wars like Gaza, where communications have severely disrupted by one of the warring parties, you cannot have information about what is going on there. And you cannot have information in terms of how you can mitigate risks or what are the risks you are facing. But I want to say one more thing, again, from the example from Ukraine. The level of information that were coming out of Ukraine during the very early stages of the war created a false sense of what is going on there, leading many humanitarian security professionals in a more conservative type of approach. While in fact, for instance, the war was mainly focused on the southern and the eastern front, and the rest of the country was relatively safe, as safe can be, obviously, a country at war. that wasn't what people could understand by checking the media and the social media. So it is a double-edged sword, if you understand what I'm trying to say, which either when you have lack of information on what is going on in Gaza, there is a possibility, or what is happening in Sudan, for instance, in Darfur, where, there might be an extreme violation of human rights and extreme, violence. Or in the other side, where you have, extreme amount of information coming out there. In both cases, there's no balance. I think we are in a very unbalanced, let's say, environment at the moment, and the era of that we are living is one of the most complex, I think, security professionals needed to navigate ever in the history of security risk management.
I agree with you. And I think as an intelligence professional that the tools that we use in intelligence, mainly intelligence analysis, looking at, how do you analyze information where there's not much information, or there is an overload of false or misdirection and misinformation. There are tools such as structured analytic techniques to obviously they're not going to solve all your problems, but they help you at least combat your cognitive biases, which is an incredible obstacle to overcome in the world we live in today, particularly since social media is shaping our worldview more and more each day. And critical thinking skills are not divided equally, let's say that, and which is why I think still humanity studies are important, because we have to understand how we think and why we think the things that we think, not to get into much of a philosophical debate there.
I absolutely agree, and I think especially when we talk about security risk management or intelligence, I think this should be considered part of the social studies. It is not something that could go to any other direction. But I have also to share with you a fun story, especially because you actually touched a lot about techniques and tools. I want to add on what you already mentioned, which, by the way, I totally agree, that it is also necessary for people to think outside of the box in many cases, because that's what is also missing somehow. Many times people are focusing on scripts, focusing on studies, focusing on the articles that they have read, but in the end of the day, especially when we talk about intelligence or security risk management, there is an element that will always be thinking out of the box type of approach. I'm not going to mention about the year or the specific location, but I was in Sudan, and one of my tasks was to do a landmine analysis in order to know where I can send my staff safely in order to proceed on operations. And when you talk about that with military people or law enforcement people of any country, they will never basically clearly demonstrate where landmines are, because they are there for a reason, and they're there to protect their own selves and the civilians that they try to take care of. So I was in a dilemma. How can I collect, this information? How I can be able to understand approximately where minefields are, so to know how far I can send my colleagues or not. So I took with me in the car, a military intelligence person, and we started driving around. And I had in front of me, a map that basically I supposed to take notes, on my phone, not the physical map. And, wherever the person was sleeping, I knew that there are no minefields, because the person was extremely relaxed, right? When the person was a bit on his edges, I knew that there is something there. I didn't need to know that there are minefields per se. I knew that there is something risky in the area because he was tense. So that was a tool, for instance, I used, from outside of the box thinking, in terms of understand, where are the risks for my staff? How far can I go? And, these are things that I believe that you cannot learn from the book. You need to learn, from programs like the one that you have launched, for instance, that people are talking with professionals, that taking experiences, from people that are in the field and collecting information from various ways. It's not something that you can read just in a book.
I agree. I mean, you've told me this story before, so it's an interesting one to look at a military intelligence professional getting nervous when you're reaching to somewhere, where he knows there's something going on, but not saying it. And just to be like a fly on the wall in that situation, I would have loved to see that. And I think perfectly you lead us into the next question that I wanted to ask you. Right now, for in your role, what are some of the tools that are maybe not as standard or are standard that you use in your toolkit to make better decisions?
I mean, what I usually do, as I said in the very beginning of our discussion, I'm extremely curious as a person, and this curiosity leads me to find solution where I don't see anything in place. For instance, one of the things I did, I took knowledge from trainings that I did about, stakeholder management and etc. that usually take place in internal terrain, let's say, of a company or of a sector. And I developed some tools that basically measuring the perception of particular actors and stakeholders in a context that I'm working. And based on this analysis, I understand what should be my stance towards them. Are those people that will influence, let's say, negotiations for a subject that is on my interest? Are those people that basically will, support me to achieve my objectives? For instance, it was in Yemen, in particularly in Taiz governorate, where we had an incident long time ago where basically one of our car been shot by a tribe and been shot by a tribe for their own reasons that it is not very important. So I tried to meet the governor of this governorate to make sure that I'm gonna take guarantees for the security of our operations. And this person wouldn't meet me. He wasn't interested to go to any discussions. He wasn't interested to speak with me. So I was thinking, how can I push this person to talk with me if he doesn't want? I don't have any power. I don't have any leverage. So then I was like, okay, I have the stakeholder analysis tool that I created only for this particular reason. Let me understand who are the influential factors for this person. And, when I understood where are those influential factors, I actually started communicating with them, suggesting that we are going to close programs impacting, their particular communities if they don't put pressure on this particular, governor to be able to meet with me. And, those tools are extremely important because actually speaking about the problem. Many times I have seen that both in the humanitarian security sector and the private security sector, people are going towards tools that are fancy, going towards tools that others are using just because others are using too, right? But they don't necessarily speak about the problem. In many cases, people are not connecting, for instance, tools with project management or tools with objectives. So one of the tools I'm using, long story short, is stakeholder analysis and stakeholder management. I'm obviously using tools such as, security risk analysis that I have developed myself in order to understand risks and threats from various aspects, including gender and diversity, which is extremely important. But I'm also using, some tools to understand, where is the next, crisis that may take place. What is the top countries in my watch list, let's say my personal watch list in terms of security risk management. So to know, if I need to focus there more than other countries that I might be covering.
What are the countries that you're watching right now?
So obviously Gaza is one of them, and then it's South Sudan and Sudan at the moment. Those are the three countries I see in terms of what is going on, and this is quite easy, if I may say, as a prediction, because both South Sudan and Sudan have produced a lot of risks in 2023. there's a lot of increase of casualties in the humanitarian sector because of those countries. With, I think, 2023 we will have 2 or 3 times more casualties than 2022, which is a significant increase. And then obviously are, countries that are impacted by climate change, that we might see a deterioration of the situation, which might be uncontrollable or outside of the spectrum that we are looking at right now. It's still South Sudan, and within them, and I would also add Syria and potentially Afghanistan, but for sure Syria.
Okay. If somebody wanted to do what you do, work in a similar role as you, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think the best advice I have, because there's no standard approach on this type of things, I would actually suggest to find the most difficult country that no one wants to go and apply there. I know it sounds funny, but this is how many of the people on the field get jobs. Find the country that no one wants to go. It doesn't matter who you know. It doesn't matter what is your educational background necessarily, as much as matters to find the right opportunity to join in the sector, as any other sector, obviously.
What else?
Well, definitely, those people need to be and remain curious. If I am successful in what I'm doing today is curiosity, and this drive of curiosity is there, and as it seems, doesn't go anywhere for good and bad reasons. But then there are also trainings that, people can do to improve their capacity. One of them, and I'm not sure if it will sound like an advertisement, but is the CSMP course from ISMI. I think this is one of the best courses for security risk management professionals out there at the moment. Extremely practical and extremely useful for everyone. But again, as I said, it doesn't really matter what is the background of people who wants to start in the sector. It matters more to find the opportunity. Small NGOs are usually more keen to hire people that are not very complete as professionals. For instance, students that finished recently, political science or security studies or whatever similar, type of studies, and they're more keen to hire them in context that there's no one else that wants to go there.
All right. And something that I'm trying to ask everybody, in your current role today, what keeps you up? Is there anything that keeps you up?
Yes, so that's a good question. I think my concern usually is if I have done enough. And I'm saying that because, in my view, our world is changing and changing fast and at the same time slow. I know it's very controversial as a statement, but I think we are in a multi-crisis era of continuing crisis. For instance, see the war in Syria, the war in Yemen, the war in Ukraine right now, which, for many analysts, and I believe that has started since 2014 and continue until today. Crises are not ending. And as crises are not ending, more crises are coming, let's say, on board. And, there is an extreme polarization in the world, At the same time, we have a shrink of cyber and physical, world realms. All of those things are creating, in my view, a very fertile environment for increase of crisis, increase of extremes, increase of, further incidents around the world. So I don't think necessarily that security professionals, we understand that our world is changing in that pace and in that level, that the systems and that the traditional system that we have explored until today, I don't think are enough anymore. So that's what keeps me up. I think we are in the edge of changing, but at the same time, we are not there yet, neither in terms of where the world is going and where the society is leading, neither in terms of the system that we have in order to control, this change.
Mm. That's very similar, I would say, to some of the things that keep me up.
And don't forget that next year, 2024, 4 billion people will vote in 1 year. This is first time happening in the history. So it's a lot of changes, a lot of coincidence at the same time. So I think 2024, it's going to be a very interesting year for our profession. Not in a good way necessarily.
Yeah. a lot of uncertainty. So before I go into my normal last question, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I would be interested to hear your opinion in terms of what keeps you up.
All right. I think what keeps me up is I look at certain countries that we are working in, that we are monitoring for clients or for ourselves, and particularly if there is people that we work with that are on the ground, what keeps me up is, are they safe, and are we putting them in unnecessary risk by asking questions about what's going on there? So in 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 a short way is the safety and security of the people that we work with on the ground. That's what keeps me up. Did we do enough? Did we make sure that they understand the risks and the duty of care that we have? That's something that keeps me up.
That's absolutely fair.
Any other questions?
Maybe what are the top countries that you are looking right now as well?
It's a good question. So I think for us, obviously the ones that you've already called, but Sudan is definitely up there. Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is kind of teetering on an edge of what's going to happen with, with terrorist rebel groups, and then Mali, all right, next door. So the trifecta of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. I think Niger in a lesser extent, but definitely Burkina Faso and Mali are up there. So those are the ones that we're looking at. I mean, I think it would be fair to say also Taiwan, but everybody's looking at that one, so I think it's not a unexpected one. What else would I say also? I know we have a list of countries that we track, but one, I mean, yeah, and high on the list is Somalia, because there's mutations happening there too that can Somalia and in tandem Kenya, I would say.
To be honest with whoever I talk, and when we reach that point of discussion, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it becomes more and more difficult on be able to say that there are 2 or 3 countries that we are looking only. I mean, in the
Yeah.
past, I remember we could record one big crisis every year in one
Hmm.
country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's multiple,
Yes.
and with
For
with
sure.
the pace things are going, it's a domino effect that one crisis may affect more than one countries at the same time. So it's not necessarily easy to predict, right?
No, it's extremely difficult, and as you said, the war in Ukraine had far-reaching effects on the global South, mainly on like food supplies and the secondary and tertiary effects of that. So
Yeah, and if you add there the climate crisis, right?
yeah, absolutely.
UN actually suggested that 60% of refugees and internally displaced people are now because of the climate change.
Yeah.
There were between like 70 million and 100 million displaced people. That those numbers are numbers that we never seen before.
No. And what is so crazy about that too is that novel novel problems with refugees that we've seen in the past are becoming disasters. And one of the very worrying effects that I am that I'm seeing more and more is the weaponization of refugees. I mean, we've seen it in the Belarusian Polish border. We're seeing it now in the Russian Finnish border. But there's a potential to see that in Gaza and Egypt border or Jordan. So I think this is a very worrying trend to weaponize refugees.
Yeah, and this happened first time in my understanding. In I think it was February or March 2020 with the Greek-Turkish borders, where there were some thousands of refugees going to the northern Greece for first time in that extent, with a lot of conflicting reports in terms of what happened and why that happened. I totally agree with you, and I want to add there that it's not only the weaponization of refugees, it's also the rule of law the rule of war is not anymore the same. It's also changing. We see targeting of hospitals, targeting of schools, targeting of infrastructure that is critical, for civilians. We see that happening in Ukraine. We see that happening in, unspeakable numbers in Gaza. We see that happening in Syria. It's not something that we have seen before. I don't recall any time in my career recording that number of hits of hospitals that, for instance, happen in Gaza right now, or children that are dying in a conflict. For instance, in Gaza right now, if I'm not wrong, there are around 4,500 children that have been killed, while in comparison, for instance, in 2022, there were 3,000 killed in global basis. So the intensity of wars and the intensity of where the world is going, I think, is in numbers that we have never seen in the past.
Absolutely. And it's what's even more shocking is we've become numb to this.
Yeah, it is a polarization that we talked earlier as well. We are keen to take sides without necessarily understand what exactly this means.
Mm, absolutely, absolutely. And it's for us, it's one of the things we try is we don't report on politics in a sense that we don't wear that on our sleeves, which is, what any good intelligence analyst should do. But as you said, if if the flow of data you're getting is somewhat or somehow corrupted, it's going to be garbage in, garbage out, right? So selecting sources has become a nightmare in itself. What to trust, who to trust, and I think keeping bias out, we're pretty good at it, but it's becoming harder and harder not to make mistakes. And I think that's another important thing. Own up to your mistakes and apologize, because I think in especially online, guys and girls that report on conflicts, when they make a mistake, they hope that people just forget because of the fast pace, as you're saying, the fast pace of changes, that people will forget the mistake I made. But when the dust settles, if the dust settles, hopefully it does, people will remember that you made mistakes and you didn't own up to them. You just left the mistakes to be. And especially if you're very active online, the internet has a long memory and people take screenshots of things you've said. So remember that impacts, the rest of your life and the rest of your career. So I think if I can give like a piece of advice to people listening, is that if you make a mistake, own up to it, fix it, apologize and move on. I mean, you don't have to grovel, but I think that's important. If you don't do that, people are just waiting for you to slip up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that is also, I think, important to mention, especially for those who are already in the security industry, is that this is also an element to take into consideration when you do your security analysis. Especially the power of social media and the need to sometimes overanalyze. What stance are you taking, especially in this polarized world that nothing is black or white. It's a very complex world that a decision cannot necessarily be as good or as bad as you initially think. It's more difficult than ever before. You see companies, for instance, that are asked to take a side in the war in Israel now are facing extremely difficult consequences that could potentially even lead them to existential threat.
Which is, I don't think anybody expected that to be the
No,
outcome.
no, absolutely not.
Or on that lighthearted note, the last question that I have for you is, what are you reading at the moment? What are you listening to? What are you watching? Any cultural recommendations? Or
Well, To be honest with you, it's a very difficult period with a lot of things, taking place. And as I said at the beginning, I cannot focus on one particular thing. So I read
Yeah.
something and then I move towards a different direction. So
Yeah, sure.
what I usually do, I read usually two books at the same time. I know that this sounds controversial, but when I feel bored in one side, I go to the other side, or somehow I find connections in between the two of them. So this period, I'm reading The Rise of Extreme Right from Khalil. Is a book that been published on 2022. It's extremely interesting book. And I'm also reading The Psychology of Revolutions from Le Bon, which has been published in 1912. Both of them are quite interconnected. And it's quite interesting to see how, especially the psychology of revolutions, how relevant they are even more than 100 years later.
Okay. And any things as escapism that you watch or listen to?
Well, I listen to your podcast from time to time when I have time.
Thank you.
Especially when I'm washing dishes
Yeah.
or running, as I said
Yeah.
to you earlier.
Yeah.
But in terms of watching, I don't have time to watch. Usually I prefer to read instead of watch things. Quite interestingly, as we were talking about James Bond earlier, there is a fun reality show that called 007. I'm not sure if you have heard that.
No, I
Which
have not.
put normal day-to-day people, do extreme things like from the movie of James Bond. For anyone who
Okay.
wants to get in the intelligence sector, I highly advise that. I'm joking.
Okay.
But that's what I'm watching when I have no power to do anything else.
Fair enough. All right, that is interesting. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. And the time really flew by. I didn't even check it up until like 5 minutes ago. Any closing thoughts from you?
No, firstly, I want to say thank you for hosting me today, and I hope that we are on time, so you will not need to do a lot of work to edit things to make it be on the right timing. But as usual, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
We've gotten better in it.
Okay, that's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
And my closing note I can say is that I would like to encourage, especially the young people that have doubts in terms of this is a right, career for them or not, to think it's less and try it. In the end of the day, nothing bad can happen by joining the sector. But also, I want to make a note for those who are on the boards and they are not investing on geopolitics or intelligence or security risk management, that they need to do it ASAP. It's not anymore about managing crisis. It's about the existence or not of their companies. The world is moving fast and moving to a direction that without that, they will not be able to continue having what they have. And I'm not saying that in a way to promote for the sector. I'm saying that because that's the reality. And we have seen both companies and humanitarian organizations, getting momentum and going ahead the game, from others that have not been invested. So it's extremely important to actually stress out that as well.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I think just focusing, as you said, on hard security and crises through, for example, GSOCs is not enough. You have to get into the domain of strategic long-term risks and mapping and understanding of actors, as you mentioned earlier. I think that's what we pride ourselves in doing at Great Dynamics, and I think we have a pretty solid track record of doing that well. But thank you again. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you if they wanted to reach out or ask you questions?
I mean, they cannot because I'm
They cannot.
in the end of the day.
Yeah, that's true.
However, for those that are professionals and they are really interested, to get in touch with me, they
Go through me.
I assume so. Do it through you, of course.
Yeah, Yeah, they can email podcast@greatdynamics.com.
Or they can
And
watch the 007 movie and pretend
yeah,
that they know me.
yeah. There you go. Thank you so much, and I'll speak to you soon. And for people listening, guys, thank you if you made it this far. Thank you for all the support. And there's some updates coming on the school as well as other cool projects we're working on. So stay tuned for that. And also for Arctic Week, which is starting in a couple of weeks. It's the last week of December. So we're doing that for the third year in a row. Yeah, thank you. And see you on the next one.